The momentous events of the morning of the 7th of December 1941 were to have a profound effect on the eventual outcome of World War II. It was then, on what President Roosevelt called a day of infamy, that a huge force of Japanese aircraft attacked the unsuspecting US Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. During the devastating raid, 19 US ships were sunk and more than 2,000 US lives were lost. The die was cast. The United States was soon firmly in the war, and Japan had taken the first steps on the road that would ultimately lead to the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
In infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The origins of one of the most infamous episodes in military history can be traced back as far as the year 1905 and the unexpected Japanese naval victory over the Russians at Tsushima. The triumph there provided the Japanese with the encouragement they needed to accelerate the pace of the naval expansion that had begun almost 50 years earlier. Japan continued to build her navy until 1922, when the Washington Conference Treaty, signed by the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, fixed the tonnage of capital ships and placed restrictions on warship construction by all three of these major naval powers. By the end of the 1930s, however, Japan was in the grip of fervent nationalism, and the world watched as political turmoil at home turned into outright aggression abroad. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria, an act carried out in defiance of the Japanese government by the all-powerful military, and which directly threatened the open-door policy of the United States towards China and its huge commercial markets. The US response, though, was weak, and emboldened by its success, Japan sought naval parity with the US at the 1934 London Naval Conference. When this was refused, she withdrew, abrogating all existing agreements and treaties, and within the year, the pace of Japanese shipbuilding had increased to such an extent that her navy posed a considerable threat to the mighty US fleet in the Pacific. While Japan eyed the riches of Eastern Asia, the USA continued to look inwards. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37 were passed by Congress in an attempt to keep the US out of any European war, reflecting the isolationist mood in the US at the time. The country received a jolt, however, when, in 1937, the Japanese further extended their Chinese interests by seizing Inner Mongolia and northern China. Perhaps the American people, who were largely sympathetic to the Chinese, expected something more than Roosevelt's famous conciliatory quarantine speech in October that year. Still, Japan persisted with her Chinese adventure, and by 1938 she controlled vast areas of the north and the center of that country. Not only this, but the methods of the Japanese army, which included the shelling of civilians, reached levels of savagery previously unseen. As a consequence, the public mood in the US turned from sympathy to outrage. But the pleas of the government for US manufacturers to place a moral embargo on Japan were hardly likely to halt the naked Japanese aggression. To add to US woes, the crisis in Europe also came to further help the Japanese in their territorial ambitions. In March 1939, Adolf Hitler's armies marched into Prague. As they did so, Japan invaded the island of Hainan. In 1940, the fall of France to the rampant Germans gave the Japanese an opportunity to march into French Indochina with the compliance of the Vichy government. Finally, the British were forced to close the Burma Road trade route to China in the same year. Events in both Japan and the USA were now moving as swiftly as those abroad. In July 1941, the USA placed a full trade embargo on Japan and froze her assets at home. In October 1941, Prince Konoe's largely moderate government fell, to be replaced by a new regime headed by the hawkish General Tojo. While in the USA, as the prospect of war loomed ever closer, Roosevelt wrestled with the twin problems of diplomatic necessity and military expediency. A final, unsuccessful attempt at mediation was made on November 20th, 1941, a mere 6 weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack. War was now inevitable. The Japanese foreign minister even warned his ambassador in Washington that unless agreement could be reached before November 29th, things were going to happen. In the USA, the reluctant American cabinet was still preoccupied with diplomatic procedure as it searched for a way to force Japan into opening hostilities without inflicting casualties or damage on US armed forces. Meanwhile, the American military was receiving decoded messages from the South Pacific that tragically it appeared to deem unimportant. Those messages carried warnings that the Japanese Air Force planned to strike first at the US naval base in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was Japan's greatest naval strategist and the man who planned the raid on Pearl Harbor. Not only was he a vastly experienced naval officer who had fought against the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, but he had also spent time in the USA, firstly as a language student at Harvard University, and later as assistant naval attaché in Washington. His time in the US had imbued him with a healthy respect for the country that was now Japan's enemy, for he had seen at first hand America's enormous industrial manufacturing capabilities. Perhaps it was this that prompted the pragmatic Yamamoto to warn his countrymen during the early months of the war, "We can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." In 1940, Yamamoto was given command of the flagship Nagato and overall command of the Japanese combined fleet. Nagumo was in command of the first air fleet, known as Kido Butai, and directed operations from the carrier Akagi. Nagumo had only a limited experience of carrier-borne warfare and was also a very cautious man. This combination persuaded him not to send in a third wave of attack aircraft at Pearl Harbor. Many military historians have concluded that Nagumo's caution may have saved the US Pacific Fleet from total destruction. Genda held the post of First Staff Officer, 1st Air Fleet, for the Pearl Harbor attack. Like Yamamoto, he too had lived and worked abroad, this time in London, where he had closely studied the Royal Navy's tactics and weaponry. Genda was deeply involved in planning the Pearl Harbor attack, even designing new types of torpedoes that were used during the raid. The confident Genda argued that the air attack should be supported by an amphibious landing, a proposal that was rejected by Japanese high command. A hugely experienced combat pilot, with more than 3,000 flying hours to his credit, Fuchida led the devastating first attack wave at Pearl Harbor. He too had been closely involved with the overall battle plan, drawing up strategy and tactics with his good friend Genda. Hard-working and capable, Fuchida had also been responsible for pilot training prior to the attack. The commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack was the highly experienced Rear Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who had been given command of the base in the early part of 1941. Kimmel had certainly been unhappy with the state of the defences at Pearl Harbor, and had instigated a rigorous improvement and training program, although he was constrained by poor supply and equipment. What was more, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet had been the focus of attention by U.S. High Command during 1940 and 1941. Throughout November, Kimmel had received warnings from Washington, including one on November the 27th, which read, "Consider this note a war warning." Unfortunately, the messages indicated that the principal threat to the base came from sabotage, and its defences were organised accordingly. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short commanded the Army forces at Pearl Harbor. A noted disciplinarian, with a reputation for carrying out orders to the letter, Short was also considered by his contemporaries to be unimaginative and lacking in initiative. Along with Kimmel, Short paid the price for the disaster at Pearl Harbor when he was dismissed shortly after the raid, a victim of his own short-sightedness and the general confusion which surrounded the U.S. defense preparations. As the combination of the US trade embargo and Japan's refusal to change her policy in Eastern Asia made war inevitable, Japanese military strategists went to work. The plan was to negate the need for a clash with the powerful US Navy during the crucial opening phase of the coming conflict. Yamamoto's plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor did exactly that, and the necessary training programs were quickly implemented. Echoing the past, the plan was given the code name Operation Z, the very same signal used by Admiral Togo at Tsushima 36 years earlier. The attack was a bold gamble, but success would bring rich rewards. Pearl Harbor was one of a series of Japanese moves in early December 1941 against targets in the Pacific that included the Philippines, Midway, Guam, and Hong Kong. These targets were carefully chosen to secure the supply of raw materials so vital to the Japanese war effort. If the Japanese war preparations thus far had been energetic and vigorous, those by the US had been slow and not a little complacent. Still believing that a resolution to the crisis could be reached through diplomacy and that no military action would be taken while discussions continued, the US was simply not on the same war footing as Japan. After a decade of isolationism, no one seemed able to believe that Japan would take the enormous step towards war with the United States. Certainly, the sheer distance between the two nations gave the US some sense of security, for it was believed, not unreasonably, that if war did come, it would be impossible for Japan to send a force against a US target without being detected. Perhaps it is with the gift of hindsight that it is obvious that the Japanese were preparing to strike. that the likely target was the US Pacific Fleet, that the defensive arrangements were inadequate, and that the US was issuing an unwitting invitation to the Japanese to strike. As we have seen, the Japanese had been building their navy at a furious pace since their withdrawal from the London Naval Conference in 1934. And by the opening of hostilities in 1941, they possessed a considerable naval force. This included 8 aircraft carriers, 10 battleships, 18 heavy cruisers, 20 light cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. A further 60 ships of various classes were under construction. In addition to this, the Japanese seamen and air crews were highly motivated and trained. They knew exactly what was expected of them as they approached Pearl Harbor. This training, along with a fearlessness that came from a belief that it was an honor to die for the Emperor, made the Japanese a formidable foe. Japanese aircraft carriers played a major role in the Pearl Harbor attack. No fewer than 8 took part. They ranged in weight from just under 16,000 tons to over 38,000 tons and carried 10, 8, and 5-inch and 25mm guns. The Japanese aircraft carriers could carry between 71 and 91 aircraft and could sail at speeds of up to 34 knots, although the fleet always travelled at the speed of the slowest vessels, which were always the support tankers. The events at Pearl Harbor announced the aircraft carrier as a major element of the modern Navy, crucial in achieving surprise over the enemy and vital for flexibility and mobility within the fleet. No less important were the aircraft aboard the carriers that provided the cutting edge of the attack. The Aichi D3A1 was the Japanese Navy's mainstay aircraft during the early years of World War II. A purpose-built, 2-seater dive bomber, it was powered by a Mitsubishi Kinsei 44 engine whose 44 cylinders allowed a top speed of some 240 miles per hour. With a range of 1,130 miles and a ceiling height of 34,450 feet, the plane carried a 550-pound bomb under the main fuselage with 2 smaller 66-pound bombs under each wing. There were 2 7.7mm machine guns fixed in the upper part of the fuselage, forward of the cockpit. 470 Aichi D3A1 aircraft were produced during the war. Although the plane was at the forefront of the Pearl Harbor attack, it soon became obsolete. The Nakajima B5N2 was a torpedo bomber crewed by 3 men. Powered by a 9-cylinder Nakajima Sakai engine and with a top speed of 235 miles per hour, the plane had a range of 1,235 miles and had a maximum operational height of 27,100 feet. It was able to carry either a 1,764-pound torpedo or 3 551-pound bombs. Armed with a rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun, more than 1,100 Nakajima torpedo bombers were produced by Japan during the war. Perhaps the most famous of all Japanese planes of World War II, however, was the Mitsubishi A6M20. 90 of these deadly fighter aircraft attacked at Pearl Harbor, 50 in the first wave and 40 in the second. Crewed by a single pilot and with a top speed of 316 miles per hour, the Zero could operate to a height of 32,800 feet, and with the use of a drop tank under the main fuselage, it could fly to a range of 1,930 miles. The Zero's two 20mm wing-mounted cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns located in the upper fuselage were complemented by the provision of an external bomb load of up to 130 pounds. 11,200 Zeros were manufactured during the war. Like that of the Japanese, the US naval fleet had been rebuilt during the late 1930s after it was scaled down in accordance with the 1922 disarmament treaty. There was little public appetite for the task as the country continued to look inwards, ignoring the growing threat to world peace from potential enemies in both the East and West. Even allowing for this reticence, the US still possessed the most powerful and formidable navy in the world. It was in 1940 that the decision was made to house the US Pacific Fleet permanently at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was not a popular posting for the men of the US Navy. Remote from the US mainland and lacking in facilities, the base soon gained a reputation for repetitious exercises and monotonous routine. In short, for boring preparation for a war that would never come. All these factors contributed to an air of complacency that would be shattered on December the 7th. The choice of Pearl Harbor for the base was in itself an acceptance by the US that Japan was now a threat to peace in the Pacific region. The move was simply too little, too late. For while the diplomats and politicians wrangled, Japan had been allowed to build a navy capable of challenging the mighty US fleet. There was in fact a radar system in use on the day of the Pearl Harbor raid, with no less than 5 early warning stations placed around the base to provide information on incoming enemy ships or planes. Indeed, the radar station at Opana clearly picked up Fushida's attack force and relayed accurate information on its size, speed, and direction. If the information had been acted upon, the outcome of the battle may have been very different. But tragically, the authorities chose to discount what the radar was clearly telling them. There were a variety of anti-aircraft weapons available for the defense of Pearl Harbor. They ranged from the .30-inch M1919 machine gun, with a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute, to the Browning .5-inch M2 that could fire 575 rounds in the same time. These weapons, however, were largely ineffective against aircraft flown at high speed and altitude. The 3-inch and 5-inch anti-aircraft guns stationed at Pearl Harbor could fire 25 rounds per minute up to heights of 30,000 feet, and would have been more effective had the Japanese not achieved the vital element of surprise. One of the very few US planes to get airborne during the raid was the Curtiss P-40 fighter plane, one of the war's most capable fighter aircraft. 2,300 were sent into action during World War II, and it was the pilots of these aircraft, with their .3 and .5-inch machine guns, who laid claim to shooting down the few Japanese planes lost during the attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor was carried out by the Japanese First Air Carrier Fleet. The force was centered around 6 aircraft carriers, the largest of which was Nagumo's command ship, the Akagi. With a crew of 2,000 and with 91 aircraft on board, the Akagi weighed in at a massive 36,500 tons and was armed with 8-inch and 25mm guns. Of similar size and capabilities was the Kaga, which had been built as a battle cruiser in 1928 and was converted in a series of refits. Carrying 70 planes and 1,100 crew was the Soryu, a carrier that had been built in 1937 and followed in 1939 by the Hiryu, the 4th aircraft carrier in the fleet. These formidable ships were joined by the newest Japanese aircraft carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. These vessels, boasting a top speed of 34 knots, carrying 84 planes each, and with crews of 1,600 men, were completed just in time for the Pearl Harbor assault. The 6 carriers of the Japanese fleet would send a total of 355 aircraft into battle on December the 7th. Supporting the great Japanese aircraft carriers were the 2 battleships, Heel and Kirishima, and 3 cruisers, the Tone, Chikuma, and Abukuma. There were also 9 destroyers, and the fleet was accompanied by 8 fuel tankers, 27 Class I submarines, and 5 midget submarines. On December the 7th, there were almost 100 ships at anchor at Pearl Harbor, but crucially, no US carriers were among them. The Saratoga was in dry dock on the US West Coast, while the Lexington and the Enterprise were away delivering planes to the US bases at Midway and Wake. These ships had been prime Japanese targets, and if their absence was a blow, there would be many other opportunities to do real damage. The battleships Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, Oklahoma, California, and Pennsylvania stood silently at anchor. With them were 29 destroyers, 4 submarines, 23 minesweepers, and an array of seaplane tenders, cargo, and repair ships. The cruisers Raleigh, Detroit, Helena, San Francisco, New Orleans, St. Louis, Honolulu, and Phoenix also beckoned for the Japanese, along with Hickam Field, Wheeler, Kaneohe, and Iwo, the 4 airfields that served the Pearl Harbor base. The attack fleet that would strike Pearl Harbor left its assembly point at Tankan Bay in the Kurile Islands to the northeast of Japan on November the 26th, 1941. Ahead lay a journey of some 3,000 miles. It was a nervous voyage, made in radio silence, that took the fleet outside the usual shipping lanes. For the Japanese knew that secrecy and surprise were absolutely vital to the success of the mission. Meanwhile, the farcical charade that passed for diplomacy continued. Even after having received instructions to destroy codes and make plans to leave Washington, and with the certain knowledge that a fleet was on its way to Pearl Harbor, Japanese diplomats kept up the pretense, although by now President Roosevelt appeared to have abandoned hopes of a peaceful solution. On December the 6th, he is reported to have said to his aides, "This means war." Roosevelt was very soon to be proved correct, for just after midnight on December the 6th, the Japanese strike force arrived at their destination, a position 230 miles north of Oahu Island from which the attack would be made. Operation Z was about to begin. Back in Washington, the U.S. Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, returned to his home from a morning bike ride at 11:30 a.m. on December the 7th. There, he found a copy of a decoded Japanese message that had been waiting for him for more than an hour. Its contents prompted Marshall to send an immediate warning to the Pearl Harbor base. The Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. today Eastern Standard Time what amounts to an ultimatum. Also, they are under orders to destroy their code machine immediately. Just what the significance of the hour may have, we do not know, but be on the alert accordingly. Unfortunately, this handwritten message did not arrive until after the first Japanese aircraft had screamed down from the blue skies above Pearl Harbor to drop their deadly payloads. The Japanese planned to attack in two waves, one after the other. The first wave of 180 aircraft was led personally by Fushida, and his formation left the aircraft carriers at 6 a.m. on the morning of December the 7th. More than an hour before the first bombs dropped, US radar detected the onrushing Japanese force. But the watch officer decided that the blips on the screen were American aircraft approaching from the mainland. At 7:55 a.m., bombs began to smash into the US fleet, and the famous words were broadcast, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." The first attack lasted for about half an hour, during which Japanese planes made 4 separate bomber torpedo attacks. Their target was Battleship Row, on the southeast shore of Hawaii, where the US battleships were lined up, invitingly, next to each other. Other Zeros poured shells into the US airfields, where, in an effort to thwart possible sabotage, the US aircraft had also been lined up in neat and convenient rows. In a short time, these air bases had been totally destroyed, with enormous loss of life. The planes attacking the battleships had been allotted particular targets, and their torpedoes soon found their mark. The battleship Arizona fared worst. The torpedoes and bombs that slammed into her turned the ship into a blazing inferno that rapidly sank beneath the waters of the harbour. With her went more than 1,000 members of her crew, who were trapped beneath decks. The Arizona was joined on the seabed by the Oklahoma and the California, and only quick counterflooding saved the West Virginia from capsizing as she too sank beneath the waves. The Tennessee, however, had been protected by the West Virginia and escaped relatively unscathed, as did the Nevada and the Maryland, which of all the battleships suffered the least damage. Elsewhere, the Raleigh, Utah, Helena, and the mine layer, Oglala, were all badly damaged or sunk. It was 8:25 a.m. before the first wave of Japanese attacks ended. After a brief lull, the second wave of 170 aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki arrived to continue the devastation of the base. But they were not to find life quite so comfortable as the first wave. A thick blanket of smoke from the damaged ships cloaked the harbour, obscuring vision. Furthermore, US personnel had manned anti-aircraft guns and, showing great bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, had attempted to fight back. Although 20 Japanese planes from the second wave were shot down, they still managed to do more crippling damage to US ships, including the Pennsylvania, the Shaw, the Cassin, and the Honolulu. The fighting over the harbour raged until 9:45 a.m., when at last the Japanese attackers turned for home. Returning to the fleet, the ruthless Fushida begged to make a final third attack on the base, an attack that he felt would utterly devastate the US Navy. Nagumo refused the request, arguing that the attack had achieved its objectives and that it would be foolish to risk further loss to the Japanese forces. The fleet began its triumphant journey back to Japan, and history will never know if Fushida's proposed third attack would have changed the course of World War II. The Japanese left behind them a scene of total devastation and destruction. In less than 2 hours over the target, they had sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 8 various other ships. "280 American aircraft had also been damaged or destroyed, and many hangars and aircraft buildings had been flattened. The cost in lives to the USA was immense. 3,500 people had become casualties. Of these, 2,403 had been killed. A third of the dead had been aboard the Arizona when it exploded into a ball of fire and sank. By contrast, the Japanese lost 5 midget submarines and 29 aircraft, these from an attack force of 360 planes. There was no doubt that as a military operation, Yamamoto's attack had been a stunning success that had, in the short term at least, removed the threat to Japan posed by the US Navy. The victory had been achieved against an underprepared and complacent enemy, who had chosen to ignore the clear signs of an impending attack and had been severely punished. As the sun set on the wreckage of the USA's most infamous military failure, the Pacific region lay firmly under Japanese control. Pearl Harbor may have been a military success, but when viewed in a wider context, the entire episode was without doubt Japan's greatest mistake. The attack had been completely unnecessary. The Pacific Fleet would have been unable to stop Japan's initial advances in any case. What better way to bring America, with all its military and industrial might, into a war that it had previously tried desperately to avoid? All meaningful debate in the US about what would be achieved by going to war for the second time in 20 years was ended. The American mood of isolationism was replaced by a desire for revenge. Eventually, Japan would pay dearly for its day of glory. Even strategically, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a mere short-term success. The biggest prize, the great US aircraft carriers, had after all been out of the harbor at the time of the attack. And the fact was that many of the battleships and destroyers damaged in the attack were soon restored to the fleet. The Nevada, for example, played its part in the bombardment of Iwo Jima and sailed as part of the Allied invasion fleet at Normandy. California, Tennessee, and West Virginia all returned to haunt and harry the Japanese during the US advance in the Philippines. Perhaps Japan would have been better served by trying to destroy oil depots and command installations rather than battleships. After the attack, Hitler was persuaded by Japan to join with them in the struggle against America. This too would prove to be an enormous blunder. Although the US regarded Germany as an enemy, how would she have gained public support for a war in the West while fighting Japan in the East? Hitler made such questions unnecessary with his declaration of war on the USA, and as a consequence, the Allies were able to agree a worldwide strategy to defeat, once and for all, the twin foes of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, searching questions were asked of the US military. How had this disaster been allowed to happen? Why were US forces on the base so unprepared for the attack? And why had they been so completely taken by surprise? Someone had to carry the can. That man was Husband E. Kimmel, who in 1942 was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet by Admiral Nimitz and charged with dereliction of duty. Kimmel retired in the same year and was eventually cleared of the charge by a congressional inquiry set up in 1946 to investigate the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Walter Short also lost his job. dismissed by those in high command who were also culpable, but were no doubt anxious to ensure that no blame attached itself to them. The main Japanese players in the story of Pearl Harbor experienced mixed fortunes throughout the remainder of the war. Mitsuo Fushida survived the war despite illness and serious wounds sustained at Midway. Converted to Christianity, Fushida traveled widely in America and Canada after the war, and in a final irony, became a US citizen in 1966. He died there in 1976. Chuichi Nagumo was shattered by the loss of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, and was subsequently transferred to the command of a small naval flotilla in the Marianas. He committed after organizing the Japanese defense of Saipan in July 1944. The greatest loss to Japan was that of Isoroku Yamamoto, who was shot down and killed during an inspection tour of the Solomons in April 1943. Despite the dramatic downturn in Japan's fortunes and his own increasing pessimism as to the eventual outcome of the war, Yamamoto had retained the respect of his superiors and the Japan rank and file. His death came as a severe and untimely blow to the Japanese cause. President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy, the greatest naval defeat suffered by a major power since Trafalgar in 1805, was eventually avenged with interest.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The world has not forgotten that catastrophic day in December 1941, when the war came to America, and America came into the war. It was on the 15th of February 1942 that British High Command began to receive the first scarcely credible reports from the Pacific. The reports confirmed that Singapore, Britain's Gibraltar of the East, had fallen into the hands of the Japanese. What was more, 130,000 men, under the command of General Percival, had also surrendered to General Yamashita's forces, as in little more than a week, the Japanese had seized one of the British Empire's most prized possessions. As usual, a somber Winston Churchill reflected the mood of the country when he described the loss of Singapore as the greatest disaster and capitulation in British history. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan made its infamous attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on the island of Hawaii. The attack was no isolated adventure. It was part of a carefully planned strategy that had as its objective the conquest of Southeast Asia. Malaya was a strategically and economically vital bastion of the British Empire. At that time, the Malay states provided more than half the world's tin ore and natural rubber, and they had been identified by the Japanese as territories vital to their expansion in the region as far back as 1938, in the now infamous Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was this crucial area that Japan intended to conquer, with the final prize being at the very southern tip of Malaya, the historic British fortress at Singapore. Nothing was left to chance. Japan's network of imperial agents worked feverishly during the summer of 1941 to provide detailed information on the region's defences to the military, who planned a huge air, land, and sea invasion during the early months of 1942. Japanese High Command had long since concluded that the conquest of Malaya and the capture of Singapore could not be achieved by an assault on the fortress from the sea. For the British had strengthened Singapore's defences with enormous 15-inch guns. It was decided instead to attack by the back door, an overland assault from the north that would take the Japanese forces down through Malaya and into Singapore. Plans were therefore drawn up for landings to be launched from the Gulf of Siam, which would put troops ashore at Patani, Singora, and Kota Baru. The Japanese also planned to advance through the dense Malayan jungle and to hook up behind the British forces that they knew would be expecting an attack by road. Like the attack on Pearl Harbour, the Japanese realized that the element of surprise was crucial to the success of the whole ambitious operation, and it was decided not to carry out preliminary bombardments of the landing positions. It was a sign of the confidence of the Japanese that the plan allowed only 100 days to secure victory. In the event, it was achieved in only 70. The British strategy for the Far East was centred on the defence of Singapore itself. Huge amounts of money, some £60 million, had been spent on strengthening the fortress there, and the project had become something of a political hot potato during the 1930s. Despite work starting, stopping, and restarting several times, the Changi naval base was finally completed in 1938. As we have already seen, the defences at Singapore had been constructed solely to withstand an invasion from the sea. Alongside the massive 15-inch gun emplacements, 4 airfields were also constructed, and there is no doubt that the Changi naval base was considered by British High Command to be impregnable to seaborne attack. Unfortunately, fewer provisions had been made for an attack on the base by land, the dangers of which had been clearly pointed out in a report sent to British Chiefs of Staff as long ago as 1937. The recommendations in the report were ignored. It would prove to be a costly mistake. Like the Americans at Pearl Harbour, the British cause was not helped by a general lack of respect for the fighting capabilities of the Japanese. The British also believed that it would be impossible for the Japanese to launch a surprise attack from the sea simply because Japan was so far away. They also reasoned that if an attack did come, they would also be able to rely on help from the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. All these factors combined to produce a sense of complacency at the Changi base that the Japanese were quick to exploit. In command of the Japanese 25th Army was Tomoyuki Yamashita, a highly regarded leader who, through his exploits, earned the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. A superb strategist, Yamashita had been sent on a special military mission to Germany and Italy in 1940, during which he had meetings with Hitler and Mussolini. He returned to Japan with severe misgivings about any war with the US or Britain, which he felt should be postponed until Japan had thoroughly modernized its army and air force. That view did not match with the nationalist fervour and mood for action that swept through pre-war Japan. A fine leader of men, Renta Motoguchi had progressed steadily through the ranks of the Japanese army since his graduation from military academy in 1910. After promotion from the position of Yamashita's chief of staff, he was given command of the 18th Division, then stationed in China. It was this division which performed so well under Motoguchi's leadership during the Malaya and Singapore campaign. Arthur Percival had been commander of the British forces in Malaya since July 1941, after a distinguished career during which he had served as a divisional commander in Britain and General Dill's chief of staff in France. The problems facing him as the Japanese poured into Malaya, though, were different from any he had confronted before. Suddenly, he was placed in charge of poorly prepared troops that were being asked to repulse a confident, highly motivated and determined enemy. If Percival was to prove unequal to the task, it was questionable whether any Allied general, given the same resources, would have been capable of shielding Malaya and Singapore from the Japanese invaders. Henry Gordon Bennett served in the First World War, ending it with the rank of Brigadier General, and was appointed General Officer commanding Australian Imperial Forces in Malaya in 1941. These forces were stationed at first at Johore under the umbrella of the Australian 8th Division. Under Bennett's command, the Australians were responsible for some courageous delaying actions as the Japanese advanced through Malaya, particularly at the River Muar, in January 1942. Bennett's style of leadership, however, attracted much criticism during and after the Malaya campaign and the fall of Singapore. Sir Robert Brooke Popham had retired from active service in 1937 to become Governor of Kenya, but he was recalled and appointed Commander of British Forces in the Far East. He inherited an area chronically short of aircraft and in poor shape for aerial defence. But Brooke Popham was unable to convince High Command in London of the seriousness of the situation. A recommendation to annex Siam, which would have made the Japanese invasion of Malaysia much more difficult, also went unheeded. And Brooke Popham's replacement had already been appointed when the Japanese forces themselves arrived there in December 1941. An excellent leader of men, Lewis Heath commanded the Indian forces present during the invasion of Malaya and the struggle for Singapore. Heath was a fine tactician and strategist who had spent most of his military career on the northwest frontier of India. Heath had a difficult relationship with Percival, who did not share his confidence in the ability of Indian troops, or have any great faith in Heath's abilities as a commander. The three divisions of the Japanese 25th Army that marched through Malaya and into Singapore were among the finest that Japan had to offer. Superbly supported by the 22nd Air Flotilla and the 11th Air Fleet, the army was organised along similar lines to the German Wehrmacht that had stormed across Europe during 1939 and 1940. Field commanders were expected to make decisions during battle without reference to their high command, an innovation which helped Japanese forces exploit local successes quickly and win victories often over numerically superior and better equipped enemies. Capably led and bolstered by the support of 200 tanks, these Japanese forces were fearsome opponents who made full use of several unusual tactics, including advancing through southern Malaya on an enormous fleet of bicycles. Their professionalism belied both their limited weaponry and equipment, and the army's relatively small size. The British and Empire troops that were expected to face the crack divisions of the Japanese army were poorly prepared and undertrained. The Far East was hardly a British priority in late 1941. That honour fell to the Middle East, and in particular North Africa. And while the British troops lacked nothing in courage, they were simply not prepared for the region's climate and conditions. Despite being bolstered by troops from India and Australia, the British forces had little chance of holding the Japanese army. Indeed, one historian concluded after the war that it was General Percival's great misfortune to preside over a hopeless campaign with an ill-equipped and wrongly trained army. And it's difficult to see how British High Command can have been surprised at events as they unfolded. Completely let down by pre-war politicians with dubious motivations and peacetime agendas, the army was cast adrift to fend for itself now that war had come, a hapless victim of political ignorance and indifference. Unlike most of the other nations involved in the escalating conflict around the world, the Japanese viewed the tank as an infantry support weapon. Unable to imagine its use as an independent strike weapon, or envisage a situation in which it would engage enemy tanks head-on, the Japanese designed their tanks with very light armour for maximum mobility. Although equipped with much smaller guns than US and British tanks, some Japanese tanks had the unusual design feature of a rear-facing machine gun. The Japanese would later discover to their cost that while these tanks were very effective at supporting infantry on the offensive, they were of less help in defensive positions. They would suffer dreadfully at the hands of bigger Allied tanks during the last years of the war. The Type 89B weighed 11.5 tons and was crewed by a team of 4 men. Introduced in 1934, it was powered by a 6-cylinder Mitsubishi diesel engine that provided a top speed of 17 miles per hour, and it was protected by armour a mere 17 millimeters thick. The Type 89B was equipped by a 57mm forward-facing gun and a 6.5mm rear-facing machine gun, both of which were situated in the turret, and there was a further gun in the hull. The Type 89B was also employed by the Japanese Navy and used in amphibious landings. With a 3-man crew, protected by 12mm armour, the Type 95 was a steady and reliable performer that was used extensively during the Japanese campaign in China in the 1930s. It was equipped by a 37mm turret-mounted gun and a 6.5mm hull-mounted machine gun. The machine weighed in at 7.5 tons. Introduced in 1935, the Type 95 was powered by a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder engine that gave a top speed of 28 miles per hour. Japanese High Command quickly identified the need for an effective long-range bomber aircraft if the campaign in the Pacific was to be successful. And the G4M1 was introduced to fulfill the role in 1941. It was powered by 2 Mitsubishi 14-cylinder engines that gave a top speed of 265 miles per hour. With a maximum range of over 3,000 miles, the G4M1 was armed with 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns. The aircraft could carry 1,000 kilograms of external bombs or one 1,764-pound torpedo. The G4M1's relatively light armaments and less than sturdy build, however, made the plane prey to enemy attack. The main weapons at the British base in Singapore were the enormous 15-inch coastal guns. These were supported by 6 9.2-inch guns, a number of 6-inch guns, 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, and a range of machine gun emplacements. Also sent to Singapore, with orders to impede the expected Japanese landings, were the battleships Repulse and the Prince of Wales, sailing under the codename Force Z. Extensive use was also made of reconnaissance aircraft by British forces in the region. Among the reconnaissance aircraft which saw action in Singapore were the Consolidated Catalina flying boat and the Bristol Blenheim. But the best was probably the Lockheed Hudson, which was introduced in 1939. Powered by 2 Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder engines, the Lockheed Hudson had a top speed of 222 miles per hour and an operational range of 1,960 miles. The aircraft was armed with .303-inch machine guns and had an internal load capacity of 1,350 pounds. The Prince of Wales was one of the most modern battleships in the entire Royal Navy, having only been at sea since May 1941. It weighed 43,000 tons and could travel at speeds of up to 28 knots. The Prince of Wales was equipped with a formidable array of armaments that included 10 14-inch guns, 16 5.25-inch guns, and 32 2-pounder guns. The battleship carried a crew of more than 1,400 men. In contrast to the Prince of Wales, HMS Repulse was a proud veteran of the First World War. She was a battle cruiser that weighed 35,000 tons and carried a crew of 1,309 men. With a top speed of 29 knots, her thin armour was protected by 6 15-inch guns and a series of 4-inch guns. Although the Repulse was considered a fast, capable ship, she was to prove no match for the Japanese torpedo bombers that swooped down on her during the battle for Singapore. The Japanese attack was launched from Indochina, and the battle was directed by Yamashita from the island of Hainan. The Japanese commander had originally been offered 5 divisions by High Command, but eventually accepted only 3. The 5th Division, under Lieutenant General Matsui, Lieutenant General Mutaguchi's 18th Division, and the Imperial Guards Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Nishimura. The 56th Division was held in reserve, but it was not needed. The 5th and 18th Divisions sailed from Hainan in 19 transports, closely supported by the 4 cruisers of the 7th Cruiser Squadron and the 2 battleships, 2 cruisers and destroyer escorts of Southern Force. In all, 60,000 Japanese troops, 200 tanks and 610 aircraft set off for their rendezvous point in the Gulf of Siam, from where they would begin the attack that would eventually lead to the capture of Singapore. The British Naval Squadron, Force Z, arrived in Singapore on the 2nd of December 1941, sailing under the command of Admiral Phillips. It consisted of the battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales, and the destroyers Electra, Express, Tenedos and Vampire. But the squadron had been allocated no air support, and was missing the carrier Indomitable, which had been damaged and was unable to sail. On land, the Malaya Command, under Lieutenant Percival, consisted of the 1st and 2nd Malaya Infantry Brigade and the 12th Indian Brigade. The 8th Australian Division came under the command of Major General Bennett, and the 3rd Indian Corps were commanded by Lieutenant General Heath. The defence of Malaya and Singapore was therefore entrusted to 130,000 men, armed with 450 guns and 110 aircraft. Although the army was able to make use of a number of armoured cars, no tanks were available for use against the Japanese invasion force. It was in the early hours of the 8th of December 1941, not yet 24 hours since the dramatic events at Pearl Harbour, that the Japanese made their landings to the north of Malaya. There were 3 landing sites. The first, at Kota Bharu, acted as a diversion for the main landings to the north at Singora and Patani. But it was not long before these main forces had driven to the south and expelled the 9th Indian Division from Kota Bharu itself. At the same time, the first waves of Japanese bombers attacked the island of Singapore to the far south, attacks for which the island was completely unprepared. Bombs also fell upon exposed airfields, and many British aircraft were destroyed. Now, the Japanese forces in Malaya began their rapid progress towards the south of the country. At sea, disaster also struck. Alerted to the Japanese fleet sailing towards Malaya, Force Z had left Singapore on the 8th of December, protected by appalling weather. It was not long, however, before the weather cleared and the British ships were spotted by Japanese aircraft. Admiral Phillips aboard the Prince of Wales realised the danger to the fleet and tried to return to Singapore via Kuantan. But on the 10th of December, they were caught on the open seas by Japanese bomber aircraft. The bombs and torpedoes rained down upon the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, both of which received multiple hits. It was not long before the two huge vessels were sinking beneath the waves, leaving the destroyer escorts to pick up more than 2,000 survivors. A total of 850 men aboard the two ships were killed, among them Admiral Phillips himself. It was the first time in history that capital ships had been sunk from the air, and the loss of Force Z tragically proved to British High Command the folly of sending ships into battle without air support. It was a hard lesson learned, for now the Japanese had gained control of the seas surrounding Malaya and Singapore. Meanwhile, on land, the town of Jitra fell to the Japanese on the 12th of December, forcing the troops of the 11th Indian Division to retreat further south towards Gurun and Craw. The pattern was now set. It was one of bitter fighting and brave but futile resistance by the British and Empire forces. On the 14th of December, the Japanese drove Indian troops from the town of Craw. Gurun fell the following day. It was now clear to Percival that the only option for his troops was an orderly tactical withdrawal to the south of Malaya, but the swift Japanese outflanking advances made through the thick jungle made this virtually impossible. The Japanese rammed home their advantage with stinging attacks from the air, and very soon the orderly withdrawal turned into chaotic retreat. In less than 10 days fighting, the Japanese advanced more than 100 miles over difficult mountainous terrain. The month of December ended much as it had begun. Lieutenant General Heath tried in vain to rally his increasingly demoralised and disorganised men in an attempt to halt the Japanese advance at the Perak River. The gallant men of the 3rd Indian Division were simply no match for their aggressive enemy, however, and they were eventually overrun, leaving High Command looking nervously over their shoulders at Kuala Lumpur, the Malayan capital. The only hope of preventing its capture was for the Japanese invasion to be contained in the north. But it was obvious that a firm foothold had been gained, and it would now take an extraordinary effort to stop them. For the Japanese, the next major prize was already in sight. It was the town of Kampar, which lay invitingly on the main road south. Heath's 3rd Division did their best to prepare its defences and waited once more for the inevitable Japanese attack. It was not long in coming. On New Year's Day, 1942, the Japanese hurled themselves on the town, while simultaneously moving troops by sea down the west coast of Malaya in order to hook up behind the 3rd Division's position. Once more, the successful outflanking manoeuvre was carried out to perfection, although Heath's brave defenders did manage to halt the Japanese advance for a few brief hours. The fighting was bitter and bloody, and on the 2nd of January, the 3rd Indian Division was forced to withdraw towards new positions at Slim River. If the battle was going badly for the British on the west coast, there was no news to cheer them from the east coast either. After the British abandonment of the Kotobaru airfield, the Japanese invaders had pressed home their advance down the sparsely populated coast, where the British troops were given long stretches of coastline to defend. What was more, the British defenders were also stretched out thinly, and their unhappy circumstances were not helped by the twin devils of poor communication and contradictory orders from the Malaya command. As a consequence, Gong Kedah, Kuala Trengganu, and Kuala Dungun all fell to the Japanese between the 8th and the 30th of December, and by New Year's Day, the vital town of Kuantan, with its huge airfield, was also in Japanese hands. Expelled from Kuantan, the 9th Division faced a long forced march to Jerantut, in the middle of the country to the north of Kuala Lumpur, where they hoped to link up with the British forces currently fighting on the west coast. With the fall of Kuantan, the Japanese had captured more than half of Malaya in less than 1 month. If speed and mobility were the key factors in the relentless Japanese advance south, another tactical innovation also helped to keep them one step ahead of the British troops. The humble bicycle, employed in huge fleets, bore entire Japanese regiments noiselessly along roads and through jungles, thus adding another vital element to their tactical superiority over the British: surprise. As the British withdrew from defensive position to defensive position, there was simply no time to prepare for the relentless Japanese attacks. On the 3rd of January, the Japanese smashed into the positions held by the 11th Indian Division on the Slim River and completely overwhelmed them. Nothing could now prevent the Japanese from capturing the Malayan capital of Kuala Lumpur. A dilemma now faced Percival and his fellow commanders. Should an attempt be made to halt the Japanese advance in the streets of the capital, or should a further withdrawal be made to Gemas, where the converging roads and narrowing countryside might offer a better chance of success? It was quickly decided that a stand at Gemas, in the Johor region of southern Malaya, would give the increasingly tired and dispirited British and Empire troops their best opportunity to stop the Japanese. Kuala Lumpur was abandoned. There was one more consideration that was uppermost in the minds of British High Command and of the British government at home. With every yard of ground gained by the Japanese, with every village or town taken, Singapore itself came under increasing threat. If the situation in Malaya was bad enough, the loss of Britain's prize Far Eastern possession was unthinkable. Try as they might, however, the troops at Gemas could not halt the Japanese. Outflanked once more by the Guards Division's lightning advance down the west coast, through Port Swettenham and Port Dickson, the defences crumbled, and another shambolic retreat further south began. On the 16th of January, the remnants of the 11th Indian Division and the Australian 8th Division, under the command of General Gordon Bennett, made a spirited stand at the River Muar, where a final desperate attempt was made to dig in. Once more, the tanks rolled in and the artillery shells rained down, and the defenders were forced to break and retreat. Percival and his troops were now in an impossible position. With the fall of Endau on the east coast on the 16th of January, and with the bombs from Japanese aircraft flying from captured airfields adding to the growing number of casualties, there were now no further options. In less than 2 months, the Japanese had advanced through and captured more than 500 miles of British-held territory. With a heavy heart, Percival issued the order on the 25th of January to abandon Malaya and for a general retreat across the Johor Strait to the island of Singapore. In the early hours of the 1st of February, the last bedraggled and exhausted remnants of Percival's British and Empire troops made their way across the causeway linking Singapore to the Malayan mainland. The causeway was promptly blown up, removing the only land access to the island. Now more than 80,000 troops, including reinforcements from the 18th Division, had joined Singapore's 1 million civilians. But from which direction would the Japanese attack come? In an attempt to cover as many eventualities as possible, Percival decided to organise the defence of the island into 3 sectors. The northern area, which covered Singapore's northeast coast, was the area that Percival deemed most likely to face the main Japanese attack, and the fresh troops of the 18th Division were sent there to join the 11th Indian Division, the 8th Indian Brigade, and the 29th Australian Brigade. The western area, on the west coast of the island, was entrusted to the Australian 8th Division, together with the 44th Indian Brigade, and the southern area, which covered Singapore City, was given to the 1st and 2nd Malaya Brigades. Huge Japanese bombing raids on the island began on the 1st of February, attacks to which the British garrison had no answer. On the evening of the 7th of February, after nearly a week of waiting, the Guards Division made an attack across the Johor Strait towards the base at Changi. It was, however, a feint, a diversionary assault that drew British attention from the main attack that was made in the western sector the following night. The fighting here was desperate. Burning oil was floated down the Johor Strait by the British forces as the Japanese made their crossing, causing many casualties. Eventually, more than 10,000 Japanese troops fought their way into Singapore that night. Gradually, the British forces were pushed back towards the Tengah airfield. On the 9th of February, Japanese soldiers of the Guards Division attacked the western sector near Kranji, pushing the 29th Australian Brigade back from the area around the causeway. By the 11th of February, the important village of Bukit Timah was in Japanese hands, giving them effective control of the west side of the island. Crucially, They had also captured the all-important reservoirs in the middle of the island, its only source of fresh water. Having abandoned the naval base to the east of the causeway, the 11th Indian Division, 8th Indian Brigade, and British 18th Division also began to retreat towards Singapore City. With each passing hour, the Japanese noose was tightening, and so Lieutenant General Yamashita contacted Lieutenant General Percival to demand the surrender of the garrison. Percival refused. It was a futile gesture that may have cost many lives. On the 12th of February, British ships and boats tried to escape from the east of the island, only to be caught by Japanese Navy patrols. Many men were killed or wounded as the Japanese gunboats attacked. On the same day, Changi itself was abandoned, and the 1st and 2nd Malaya brigades were withdrawn to form a perimeter with their comrades around Singapore City. Over the next 2 days, the defensive perimeter shrank even further as the Japanese pressed forward. On the morning of the 15th of February, a tired Percival finally called a conference with his commanders. There were few options left for the British forces now. A counterattack was briefly discussed, but rejected. What had changed to offer the prospect of its success? There were still 1 million civilians on the island, and some 130,000 troops. Supplies were dangerously low, and best estimates put the remaining fresh water at enough for only 1 more day. A protracted siege was therefore out of the question. Percival concluded that there was no alternative. He surrendered Singapore to Yamashita during the evening of the 15th of February. With the Japanese victory at Singapore, the sun set on the British Empire in the east, and the door was opened for further Japanese successes in the Pacific. Within a few weeks, the Dutch East Indies had collapsed, and Burma had been overrun as the Japanese swept on to the Indian frontier. The Americans, too, were caught in the teeth of the Japanese storm, as, despite a gallant defensive action that lasted 4 months, Bataan surrendered in May 1942. 2,330 Americans, and perhaps 10,000 men in all, died of starvation, disease, or brutality during the subsequent forced march from Mariveles to San Fernando. This, along with the appalling cruelty to British prisoners in Burma, were the first examples of the Japanese soldiers' contempt for enemy troops who had surrendered rather than die in battle. Such barbarous episodes were to become a tragic feature of the Pacific War. On Singapore itself, 130,000 British and Empire troops passed into a harsh captivity that would last for 3.5 years. 8,500 men had been killed during the Japanese campaign. The civilian population suffered too, as the local Chinese were subjected to many painful indignities by their Japanese captors. There was nothing anyone could do, for now the initiative and the momentum was firmly with Japan. It would take years of toil, fighting, and sacrifice to wrest it from them. Back in Britain, hands were wrung and indignant questions were asked. How had this tragedy been allowed to come to pass? Naturally, the blame fell on the military, and particularly on General Percival, who was now in Japanese hands. The politicians who chorused their disapproval seemed less keen to remember or discuss the neglect, complacency, and ineptitude of the pre-war years, all of which had contributed to Singapore's downfall. However clever and determined the enemy, and however incompetent the politicians, the military were also responsible for the disaster. Singapore's defences completely ignored the possibility of a land attack. The troops there were poor and ill-trained, and the entire garrison was badly equipped. 2 sunken battleships and hundreds of lives bore witness to the folly of sending a naval fleet to sea without air cover. And surely, never again would an enemy's fighting capabilities be so criminally underestimated. Those men who had orchestrated the extraordinary events in Malaya and Singapore were to experience mixed fortunes during the remainder of the war. Tomoyuki Yamashita eventually surrendered with what was left of his army at Baguio in September 1945. He was tried before a court in Manila and convicted of war crimes, and although he vehemently denied complicity in Japanese atrocities, the world was in no mood to listen. Yamashita, controversially, went to the gallows in February 1946. Arthur Percival, upon whose shoulders so much blame fell after the Malayan and Singapore debacle, survived Japanese captivity, and in a final sweet irony, was present at the eventual Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay in 1945. He died in 1946. The capture of Singapore was but one in a string of Japanese successes which were the hallmark of their entry into the Second World War. It would not be long before their star would wane, just as Admiral Yamamoto had predicted before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbour. Soon, the Allies would find a way to turn back the tide and send Japan to a defeat that would end in an atomic nightmare. But under the hot Pacific sun during 1941 and 42, the world was introduced to the power of the land of the rising sun.